nous tous sommes dans la grande solidarité et même douleur pour les événements de Paris. Et au nom aussi du président Franco Buzzi, on avait déjà fait un communiqué de l'Ambrosiana à cause de l'attentat ici contre un juif orthodoxe qui a eu lieu ces jours-là. Mais maintenant, nous allons exprimer toute notre solidarité aux habitants de la ville de Paris qui ont subi toute cette série d'horribles, tragiques attentats. Ça, c'est la première chose pour poser un instant de silence. On reste debout. Merci. Nous commençons nos travaux. Merci à Alberto Camprani qui va tenir la présidence ce matin.
Buongiorno a tutti, stamattina iniziamo con una conferenza del padre Justin Zitisa Guyanimina qui étude à la faculté de théologie catholique, à la faculté de l'Institut catholique de Paris et qui étude les communautés chrétiennes en Afrique, le problème des identités. Merci.
Merci bien. Donc ma contribution porte sur maladie et guérison dans la société Congo en République démocratique du Congo. J'ai tenté de donner un sous-titre des limitations à cette large contribution. Donc je vais essayer ici de faire quelques approches et de relever quelques questions théologiques liées à la conception de la maladie et de la guérison dans la société Congo. C'est vraiment pour moi un honneur et un grand honneur de pouvoir prendre la parole dans ce colloque sur transcendance, personne et pouvoir qui est organisé par la classe des études africaines de l'Académie ambrosienne. J'aimerais avant toute chose remercier le préfet et le vice-préfet de cette académie, Monseigneur Franco Buzzi et Monseigneur Pierre Francesco Fumagalli, qui m'ont offert la possibilité de l'opportunité de cette intervention. J'adresse évidemment aussi les mêmes remerciements au professeur Pierluigi Valsecchi, coordinateur de ce colloque. Quand je l'informais au mois de juin passé du projet de faire porter ma communication à ce colloque sur les thèmes de maladie et guérison dans une société particulière, la société Congo, en République démocratique du Congo, j'étais littéralement désarmé par l'approbation quasi spontanée qu'il donnait au projet de ma contribution. J'estimais en effet que, par son approbation, que ma contribution était jugée d'emblée compatible avec l'argument général de ce colloque. Mais je dois avouer que peu à peu, en commençant à analyser les matériaux dont je disposais pour l'étude de ma matière, la compatibilité et donc le lien du sujet de ma relation avec la thématique générale de ce colloque m'était paru finalement quelque peu problématique. Et ma réflexion sur le caractère problématique de ma contribution, sur le caractère problématique du lien de ma contribution avec le thème de ce colloque va me donner l'occasion de formuler dans le premier point de cette intervention quelques observations sur la pensée africaine, quelques observations sur une certaine épistémologie de la pensée africaine. Exigence épistémologique d'une pensée africaine. Dans le sujet de ma contribution, maladie et guérison dans la société Congo, j'ai touché presque du doigt la réalité immédiate de ce qu'est maladie et de ce qu'est guérison chez les Bas-Congo. Alors que dans le thème du colloque, transcendance, personne et pouvoir, je semblais me heurter à l'abstraction, à une abstraction conceptuelle dans cette trilogie. Et du coup, je me posais une question. Et voici cette question. L'abstraction conceptuelle que nous rencontrons dans l'intitulé de ce colloque ne s'oppose-t-elle pas en principe ou ne serait-elle pas étrangère à la forme essentielle de la culture africaine? Et je dois préciser à la culture négro-africaine, car il semble que la vision du monde africaine se donne à être perçue dans des représentations concrètes, dans des symboles, dans des attitudes, dans des gestes, bref, dans une matérialité qui conduit la pensée à une sorte de concrétude et de réalisme dont on ne pourrait rendre compte qu'en demeurant dans la proximité du langage matériel. Autrement dit, dans le contexte africain, si l'on peut parler de transcendance, c'est parce qu'il y a le transcendant ou des êtres transcendants et que l'on peut nommer. De la même manière, si l'on peut parler de personne ou de la personne, ce ne peut l'être qu'à partir de telles personnes physiques et concrètes dans leur être au monde le plus immédiat et le plus existentiel. Il en va de même de la notion de pouvoir et puissance dans la perspective d'une certaine Afrique. Et oui, l'Afrique est plurielle et diversifiée. Pouvoir ou puissance ne signifie pas autre chose que les actes, les gestes, les paroles de ceux qui détiennent quelque pouvoir ou une certaine puissance dans les Afriques. Alors, pour peu que mon observation soit pertinente, elle convie du moins le chercheur africain à un travail d'herméneutique des cultures et des sociétés africaines à mener avec le plus grand respect épistémologique envers son objet d'étude, car l'objet d'étude africain posséderait en soi une certaine épistémologie dans laquelle le chercheur est invité à entrer et à pénétrer progressivement avant de lui appliquer ses propres catégories épistémologiques qui pourraient parfois devenir déformantes et tendancieuses. S'agissant précisément de la maladie et de la guérison dans la société Congo, toute systématisation ou toute élaboration conceptuelle de ces notions suppose une étude minutieuse des significations profondes et globales de l'expérience de la maladie et des pratiques de guérison telles que cette expérience est vécue, telle qu'elle est sentie par les Congos et telles que aussi ces pratiques de les pratiques de guérison y afférentes sont mises en œuvre. Cette vigilance épistémologique et méthodologique s'impose plus particulièrement et peut-être même avec beaucoup plus d'acuité aux théologiens à qui il incombe de penser les rapports entre les cultures particulières et la culture chrétienne ou l'évangile. Nous savons que les théologiens exercent un vrai ministère théologique quand il engage sa responsabilité réflexive critique en faveur d'une rencontre harmonieuse des cultures. Et c'est en quelque sorte cette tâche que nous voudrions nous imposer dans cette étude. Notre propos principal étant d'esquisser une approche de la conception Congo de la maladie et de la souffrance sous le double angle de la théologie de l'inculturation de l'évangile et de l'évangélisation des cultures. Une question précise habite et parcourt cette approche, l'approche que je vais esquisser ici, à savoir comment les conceptions et pratiques Congo de la maladie et de la guérison peuvent-elles entrer en dialogue harmonieux avec le message chrétien qui y correspond, et quel est précisément ce message? Pour les théologiens, autant la conception Congo de la maladie et de la guérison est sujette à une interprétation profonde qui puisse dégager ses significations fondamentales, autant le message chrétien lui-même est aussi passible d'une véritable fouine herméneutique qui doit s'efforcer de dégager le contenu et le sens focal de l'enseignement chrétien, susceptible de rimer et d'entrer en consonance avec les significations profondes de l'expérience culturelle. Et ce sens focal de l'évangile, qui est continuellement recherché par les théologiens, ne se donne pas malheureusement dans la lettre de la Sacra Scriptura, ni dans les formules dogmatiques figées. Ce sens est à élaborer constamment en réinterprétant la pratique thérapeutique de Jésus et de son enseignement sur le salut, en revisitant les reprises néo-testamentaires de l'enseignement de Jésus, en revisitant aussi les formulations des pères, les développements patristiques, les approfondissements magistériels et les systématisations théologiques. Comme on le voit, la rencontre d'une culture particulière avec l'Évangile décrit et prescrit un champ d'investigation théologique immense. Il serait important d'ailleurs, mais je ne veux pas m'y attarder, de voir un peu comment dans l'histoire la rencontre de la culture Congo et de la culture chrétienne peut être périodisée. Et chaque période est marquée fortement par des caractéristiques qui montrent la position des cultures qui entrent en présence. Très rapidement, on peut dire que la culture Congo entre en contact avec la culture chrétienne occidentale à partir du XVe siècle, quand Diego Cao découvre l'embouchure du fleuve Congo. Diego Cao et les Portugais qui le suivent découvrent un pays fortement bien organisé, le Royaume Congo, avec des institutions socio-administratives dont les historiens attestent vraiment de la vigueur et de la vivacité. Alors les Portugais, en cette époque-là, entrent en dialogue avec le Royaume Congo comme dans un véritable partenariat. Ils ne viennent pas coloniser, ils ne viennent pas occuper, ils ont des idées derrière la tête, et là, ils se présentent devant, ils font face à un roi qu'ils ne peuvent pas vassaliser. Donc en ce moment-là, on peut dire, dans cette première rencontre, on peut dire que la culture Congo et la culture chrétienne se rencontrent comme de vrais partenaires, apparemment comme de vrais partenaires. Oui, je dis bien apparemment, car dans le fond des choses, et au regard de l'essence respective de ces deux cultures, entre lesquelles il existe une différence énorme, c'est que la culture Congo, dans ses aspects religieux, n'est pas d'essence propagandiste et prosélytique. La culture Congo se présente comme une réalité close et initiatique, ne disposant ni d'aucune profession codiciée, ni de formules dogmatiques. Elle se déploie à l'intérieur des limites fermées de la famille, du clan et du royaume. La culture Congo est d'essence non dialogale, tandis que la culture luso-chrétienne, qui vient au devant de la culture Congo, est tout à son antipode, car cette culture portugaise est pétrie dans une religion à vocation et à prétention universelle très militante. L'expansion de cette religion est justement un début de l'exploration des mers à laquelle les Portugais se livrent sous le mandat et le privilège papal du Padroado, qui leur est concédé pour la conversion des païens et des musulmans. En plus, l'appartenance à cette culture religieuse chrétienne passe par des rites officiels et elle consigne l'adhérent à l'observation d'un code moral bien défini. Et donc, dans cette première rencontre de la culture Congo et de la culture chrétienne portugaise, il se passe finalement que le roi se présente comme en position d'infériorité. Ce n'est pas tellement un dialogue de partenaire à partenaire. Le roi embrasse la culture étrangère, la culture chrétienne, et cette culture chrétienne, petit à petit, va lui ravir son pouvoir qui est symbolisé par le fétiche, par tout un tas de choses que la religion chrétienne va essayer de mettre de côté. Et donc, la puissance et la force du roi s'affaiblira. Le deuxième moment que je vais évoquer très rapidement de cette rencontre, c'est à partir de la conférence de Berlin, quand les puissances occidentales se partagent l'Afrique et qu'elles veulent occuper les différents territoires qui leur ont été répartis. Eh bien, les puissances occidentales ou l'État belge qui arrive au Congo ne rencontre absolument rien, absolument rien. Le royaume Congo était déjà tombé en désuétude, à déclin, depuis la fin du XVIIe siècle avec la bataille d'Ambuila. Plus rien du royaume Congo, plus de structures socio-administratives, ni politiques. Il existe à peine quelques chefs locaux qui dirigent les clans et les familles. Donc les Belges arrivent, on pourrait dire, sur un terrain vierge et neutre. Vierge et neutre, mais ils le neutraliseront davantage en faisant table rase de tout ce qui est culture indigène, de tout ce qui est culture locale, de tout ce qui est culture Congo. Et cette période va jusqu'à l'indépendance. Et finalement, à l'indépendance, nous voyons un mouvement, l'émergence d'un mouvement de revendication d'indépendance, d'autonomie et d'autodétermination. Et dans le Congo en particulier, ce mouvement prendra des formes radicales quand, vers les années 1970, le président Mobutu a lancé la politique du recours à l'authenticité, suppression des prénoms chrétiens, suppression de l'enseignement de la religion et de la morale dans les écoles, guerre iconoclaste, car dans les écoles qui étaient autrefois des écoles conventionnelles catholiques, où on trouvait des crucifix au mur, tous les crucifix avaient été détrônés et on y avait remplacé l'effigie du président Mobutu. Alors, je vais en venir avec ce long préliminaire à vous présenter très rapidement la signification de la maladie et de la guérison dans ce qu'on peut appeler l'anthropothéocosmologie Congo. Car dans la culture Congo, concevoir la maladie ou concevoir des pratiques de guérison s'insère forcément dans une représentation complexe que le Congo se fond du monde, des dieux, des hommes, de la nature, des animaux, des plantes, j'allais dire de toutes choses. Le Congo reconnaît l'existence d'un Dieu tout-puissant qu'ils appellent Nzambi Mpungu. Ces dieux se présentent de façon contrastée, tantôt trop éloignés du monde des vivants qu'ils semblent déléguer ce pouvoir aux ancêtres. Et les ancêtres sont les défunts au cœur bon, au cœur droit. Donc tantôt trop éloignés du monde qu'ils semblent déléguer tous ces pouvoirs aux ancêtres. Tantôt si proches du monde des vivants et comme l'habitant presque que tout dans le monde des vivants, que tout dans le monde sent et transpire la présence de Dieu. Là, on peut se poser la question d'une certaine limite entre le panthéisme, l'immanenthéisme et la transcendance de Dieu. Les Congos conçoivent le monde comme divisé en deux, monde visible et monde invisible. À ces deux mondes participent Dieu et l'ensemble de tous les êtres visibles et invisibles, à l'exception des hommes vivants ordinaires qui semblent être confinés aux seules limites du monde visible. Entre ces deux mondes, visible et invisible, les limites paraissent tellement poreuses. L'action des habitants de l'un interférant avec celui des autres, que l'on peut même considérer qu'il existe un troisième monde intermédiaire qui est à l'intercession entre les deux. Et s'agissant de l'homme, les Congos sont portés à croire qu'il existe trois types ou trois catégories d'hommes. Les hommes ordinaires, ceux qui sont dotés du savoir commun, savoir du jour, savoir commun à tous, ceux qui savent planter, ceux qui savent récolter, ceux qui savent faire la chasse. Voilà le savoir ordinaire de l'homme. Mais il y a en second lieu, en deuxième lieu, les hommes aux yeux ouverts. Les hommes aux yeux ouverts, c'est-à-dire dotés d'une intelligence de la nuit nocturne, dotés de nyctosophie, mayela, mampimpa. Et enfin, il y a des hommes esprits, des hommes esprits, c'est-à-dire c'est la réincarnation des ancêtres qui ne sont pas encore totalement admis dans le village des ancêtres. Quant aux êtres autres du cosmos, qu'il s'agisse de la faune et de la flore ou encore de la matière inanimée, tous les êtres sont traversés par le circuit vital qui arrose l'ensemble du cosmos en ces deux mondes. Et bien que ces êtres ne possèdent pas une âme, car seul l'homme a une âme, ces êtres possèdent, les autres êtres de l'univers possèdent néanmoins une force vitale qui les fait participer à l'ordre et au désordre de l'ensemble, animisme ou panvitalisme. Soulignons enfin que le monde Congo est rempli d'une foule d'esprits souvent méchants qui sont en errance et que le Congo identifie comme les défunts qui ne peuvent accéder au village des ancêtres. Le village des ancêtres est littéralement et matériellement le cimetière, pour la raison que ces défunts n'avaient pas mené une vie correcte. Nous pourrions résumer cette sommaire présentation de la conception Congo du monde, de l'homme et de Dieu en soulignant la connexion et l'interconnexion des divers constituants de cette triade. Et nous avons là une grande complexité fonctionnelle et panvitaliste. Le problème essentiel dans la pensée culturelle Congo est donc celui d'assurer et de maintenir l'harmonie globale dans ce vaste ensemble. L'attention prêtée au maintien de cet équilibre est tellement forte que toute adversité, tout accident qui arrive dans le monde de vivant est pressenti comme un dérèglement de l'ordre anthropothéo-cosmologique. Ainsi en est-il de la maladie humaine. Les populations Congo la conçoivent bien souvent comme un syndrome social. Le sociologue Sondak a vu juste en appelant la maladie une métaphore du social. Il serait intéressant de relever que le système nosologique Congo, qui tend à classifier les maladies selon leur causalité, le regroupe en 3 catégories. Il y a les maladies ordinaires, qui sont jugées normales. Ce sont des maladies passagères. Quand on a mangé un champignon vénéneux, les Congos savent que le champignon est vénéneux et qu'on tombe malade, eh bien là, c'est bien une maladie ordinaire. Il y a ensuite des maladies qualifiées des maladies du monde. Eh bien là, c'est des traductions. Maladies du monde. Ces maladies du monde causées par le monde dans lequel l'homme est inséré, ces maladies sont anormales. Elles sont anormales par leur caractère inquiétant, du fait de leur chronicité, de leur récurrence, de leur résistance, de leur violence. Nous avons une belle description de ces maladies donnée par le professeur Kimpianga Mahania que je ne peux pas reproduire ici. Et la dernière catégorie de maladies que le Congo juge aussi normale est qualifiée de maladie venant de Dieu. Venant de Dieu. C'est de nouveau une traduction. Il s'agit des maladies qui surviennent dans la vieillesse ou qui résistent à toute la panoplie des traitements. Donc nous voyons ici que la pathogénèse Congo invoque une pluralité de causes de la maladie qui embrasse toutes les dimensions de l'ordre anthropothéo-cosmogonique. Il n'y a nul doute que la démarche thérapeutique qui y correspond advient aussi avec la même complexité. Et de plus, nous allons voir que la thérapeutique Congo met en branle non pas seulement le malade ou le patient, mais l'ensemble des acteurs et participants à l'ordre social dont la maladie d'un individu est l'épiphénomène. La thérapeutique Congo se déploie en pharmacothérapie d'une part et en psychothérapie de l'autre. En tant que pharmacothérapie, la thérapeutique Congo recourt simplement à l'usage de plantes auxquelles les Congos reconnaissent une vraie valeur médicale en cas de maladie reconnue ordinaire et normale. Mais la thérapeutique Congo devient complexe en tant que psychothérapie quand la thérapeutique doit s'occuper des dimensions et des causes sociales de la maladie. Alors, la psychothérapie elle-même est pratiquée dans la société Congo par 3 catégories de personnes. D'une part, le chef sacré, le chef intronisé. Il est habilité à procéder à des rites médico-religieux dans le cadre de la famille pour ramener et invoquer la communion et la réconciliation avec le monde invisible, pour obtenir le pardon et l'apaisement du courroux des ancêtres. Ça, c'est le chef consacré. Mais il y a aussi le prêtre médico-rituel. Ce prêtre, lui, intervient dans toutes les maladies jugées anormales. Par le recours à la divination, il cherche l'étiologie de la maladie et administre des médicaments sacrés et rituels appelés, dans la traduction, fétiche. Mais il existe un mot nkisi pour le dire chez les Bakongo. L'effet de ces médicaments sacrés et rituels est d'obtenir l'assainissement des relations avec les esprits, les ancêtres et les sorciers qui sont considérés comme les responsables de la maladie à un degré ou à un autre. Et le troisième praticien de la psychothérapie dans la société Congo, c'est les spirito-psychothérapeutes. Les spirito-psychothérapeutes. Celui-là, il prétend être habité par l'esprit de Dieu Tout-Puissant, et par la prière, par la parole, il accorde la consolation, il accorde le salut à tous ceux qui sont malades. Je vais conclure. Ce qui semble être au cœur de la signification africaine de la maladie, c'est qu'elle est bâtie sur la notion du mal. La notion du mal dont le malade subit les conséquences, soit comme auteur de ce mal, soit tout simplement comme une victime innocente. Ce mal envahit le malade sans qu'il en soit ni responsable, ni coupable, ou parfois responsable et coupable, ou dans tous les cas, le jeu social tend à lui refuser personnellement cette responsabilité, puisque la solution à ce mal n'est jamais recherchée dans la coopération libre et active du malade, de l'être malade, mais seulement dans le jeu de force sociale. L'homme Congo se fondrait ou se diluerait, pour ainsi dire, dans une espèce d'homme social, d'un corps social qui ne lui appartient plus, pas d'ailleurs, qu'il n'est plus d'ailleurs. Dans cette mesure, la maladie apparaît comme le lieu de manifestation des forces sociales et des pouvoirs sociaux concurrentiels et rivaux, entre lesquels l'équilibre ne repose sur rien d'autre que sur la peur, que sur le jeu de force, des représentations indifférenciées du monde. Il me semble que les pouvoirs en jeu dans la conception Congo de la maladie et des pratiques de guérison soient assez oppressifs et ne soient pas totalement tournés vers le bien exclusif du malade, mais plutôt vers l'autoconservation du pouvoir par les pouvoirs sociaux. Il y aurait même à penser que les pouvoirs sociaux détrônent quelque peu Dieu. Oui, Dieu est comme détrôné, car dans l'expérience Congo de la maladie et des pratiques de la guérison, la transcendance qui est Dieu se confond avec une invisibilité qui signe quelque peu sa mort et sa disparition. Il nous semble possible, et ça c'est une piste de recherche, il nous semble possible de proposer au sein de cette articulation Congo de la conception de la maladie et de la guérison la notion chrétienne de péché, péché individuel et communautaire, qui suppose la responsabilité pleinement assumée, et de proposer en même temps, au cœur de cette conception Congo de la maladie et de la guérison, d'y proposer le pendant, ou j'allais dire, oui, le pendant nécessaire de la notion du péché, qui est la conversion. Parce que la conversion suppose un engagement personnel et en même temps communautaire, qui seul semble être les conditions pour tendre vers une communion et une union vitale qui sont tellement prisées dans la société Congo. Merci et je vous remercie.
Ringraziamo padre Zitisa e penso che sia opportuno che lui corri in aeroporto perché dovrebbe essere là alle 10, quindi non so se adesso come si svolgono le cose. Il padre Fumagalli c'è un momento di forse ecco, lui chiedeva se c'è qualche domanda adesso, perché lui appunto sta andando in aeroporto. Padre René?
Je voulais demander quelle est la place du sorcier dans la société Congo, parce que vous avez parlé du chef, du prêtre guérisseur, comme étant quelqu'un différent du sorcier. Souvent on a tendance à les joindre comme étant les deux aspects de la même personne.
Le sorcier n'a pas de place institutionnelle, parce que dans le jeu social, il constitue une antiforce. Et donc, il n'a pas forcément une place institutionnelle dans la société Congo. Mais n'empêche que la société Congo a la notion positive de la sorcellerie. C'est-à-dire, ceux qui sont doués de ce que j'ai appelé ici, ceux qui sont doués de l'intelligence nocturne, eh bien, ils peuvent utiliser cette intelligence de façon ambivalente et de façon positive surtout. C'est ce que fait le chef de clan ou le chef consacré quand il se met à protéger sa troupe familiale contre les invasions extérieures. Donc le sorcier n'a pas, comme tel, le sorcier négatif n'a pas de place institutionnelle dans la société Congo.
Grazie, come avete visto abbiamo cambiato leggermente l'ordine degli interventi perché il padre deve partire immediatamente. Lo salutiamo e gli auguriamo buon viaggio visto che deve andare a Parigi. A questo punto noi riprenderemo l'ordine degli interventi, però prima ci sarà un momento, quindi prima di Enrique Rebeya ci sarà un momento di... Allora noi proseguiamo con gli interventi, poi magari nel momento dell'intervallo durante l'intervento. Va bene.
Dimenticavo, the president of the academy, who arrived and we already met him, will convene just for 10 minutes the steering committee, il consiglio direttivo. At 11:30 approximately we will finish our work, our academic conferences, and then the steering committee is convened just for greetings or final points with the president. Thank you. Grazie.
Allora è un vero piacere poter presentare Enrique Rebeya, con il quale sono entrato in contatto tantissimi anni fa all'interno di una organizzazione che in Italia si occupava di storia del cristianesimo e delle identità cristiane primitive, era raccolta attorno ad una rivista, Gli Analisi di Storia dell'Esegesi. Attualmente è di formazione parigina, quindi direi che lì il cuore della sua formazione sia lì. Attualmente insegna alla Cornell University e il motivo per cui lo abbiamo invitato è per questo suo interesse estremamente appassionato verso il tema della predicazione, della pratica religiosa, della sepoltura quale sistema di formazione delle identità cristiane nell'Africa settentrionale, quindi l'Africa da Tertulliano fino ad Agostino. Vous êtes très bienvenue et je vous donne la parole.
Merci beaucoup, merci aux organisateurs pour leur invitation. Je fais ma présentation en anglais comme on me l'avait demandé. So the title is very large and of course I can't in the little time I have deal with all aspects of this, and as I will explain in a minute, I focused on only one aspect of the relationship between burial and religion. One more indication before starting. North Africa, for people working on the classical world, means mainly the province of Africa Proconsularis, so modern Tunisia and part of Algeria. And as you will see in my presentation, I mentioned Carthage, which was the capital of Africa Proconsularis, and also the city of Churchill that is now in Algeria. Sorry. So it has often been assumed that religious segregation of the dead was the norm in late antiquity. In this short presentation, I will challenge this notion by revisiting the North African evidence, both textual and material, for the burial of early Christians. I will pay particular attention to the origins of this assumption, as it is crucial to understand how it was formed in order to deconstruct it and examine the evidence afresh. And by looking at the origins of this assumption, it will make also a connection with most of the presentations at this conference, as I will be looking at late 19th and early 20th century excavators in North Africa, and the way they were working, and the way they were putting together texts and material. I start with the excavation of two funerary enclosures in Carthage, conducted by Alfred Louis Delattre, who was one of the most active explorers of Carthage at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Father Delattre, who lived between 1850 and 1932, entered into the Society of the White Fathers, or Society of the Missionaries of Africa, and was sent as a missionary to Algeria. There, it was the Cardinal Lavigerie, who was the founder of the White Fathers, and at the time Archbishop of Algiers, who involved him in the archaeological exploration of Carthage. Funerary enclosures are spaces surrounded by walls, but not roofed, and they are usually located within larger burial areas. So they're not isolated in themselves, they're within a large cemetery, just enclosed. Depending on their size, they can accommodate from half a dozen tombs to several hundreds. Alfred Louis Delattre excavated two such enclosures to the south and west of the city, one pagan and one Christian. The pagan enclosure is the famous cemetery of the Officiales. They were imperial slaves and freedmen in the service of the governor of Carthage. The cemetery was about 1,000 square meters and probably contained 300 burials. Delattre, and that's typical of the way archaeology was done at the time, is mainly looking for inscriptions. So he is indicating only the number of inscriptions retrieved, not the number of actual burials. And from what we know from more recent excavation, there were probably many more burials, but they left no trace. Walls around the enclosure were found on the four sides. This cemetery was used until the end of the 2nd century, after which the Officiales used another cemetery in the vicinity until the end of the 3rd century. However, no wall has been unearthed for this second one. And I mentioned this little detail to show that we should not assume that the presence of walls is in itself meaningful. We have the same group of people over time choosing in one case to use an enclosure, and in another case just to group their tombs without walls around, within, in both cases, a larger necropolis. The Christian enclosure now, it was found in the vicinity of the first one, roughly 110 meters north of the enclosure of the Officiales. Delattre affirms that it was walled, but mentions only one east-west wall, and it's not very clear that he actually found evidence of other walls. Again, a detail that will take sense later. The cemetery was only partly excavated. According to the shape of the letters on the inscriptions and to the formulae, the cemetery began to be used in the second half of the 4th century. So slightly later than the first two I mentioned, but not very much. No information is given about the size of the enclosure, because the walls were not excavated, unearthed, and no information neither about the number of tombs it contained. The paucity of information given about these two enclosures is typical of 19th and early 20th century excavation reports. These frequently offer no more information than a very brief and general description of the site, as their main interest was in finding new inscriptions. And I don't want to blame these early archaeologists for this practice at the time. That was the way it was done, and without their work, we would know so little about the first 3 centuries of North Africa. That was really crucial. They saved thousands of inscriptions that we may not have otherwise. More recent excavations in Carthage have unearthed mainly late 5th to 7th century burials, so much later, with the result that for earlier periods, we still depend largely upon these less than satisfactory excavation reports. There is one exception, the Yasmina necropolis, that was excavated by the University of Georgia between 1992 and 1997 in the same area as the two enclosures dealt with by Delattre. However, little information is available as yet on the first phases of the occupation of the site, the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The excavation team published only the 7th century enclosure where child burials were found. It's relatively exceptional, and hence their interest. But when we'll have more information on the first occupation, that will allow us to put the two enclosures I mentioned, excavated by Delattre, in a wider archaeological context. An obvious conclusion to be drawn from the two cemeteries, or two enclosures excavated by Delattre, is that even if they are not strictly contemporary, they attest that burial within an enclosure was a practice shared by pagans and Christians. Indeed, Auguste Odolant, in his 1901 synthesis on Roman Carthage, points out that the Christian enclosure is, in fact, not very different from the pagan one. However, Delattre compared the Christian enclosure to one that had recently been excavated in the ancient Caesarea, modern Churchill in Algeria, by Cardinal Lavigerie. And the original decision to compare it to another Christian enclosure rather than to contemporary pagan enclosure that he excavated himself is in itself interesting. This excavation in Churchill was conducted at the site of the discovery of a Christian inscription describing the donation of a burial ground, calling it in Latin area ad sepulchra. And I keep the Latin for now, as you will see the translation is already an interpretation. Delattre then recalls that other areae, the plural in Latin, are known in Carthage through the text, in particular the areas of the governor Macrobius Candidatus, where, according to the tradition, Cyprian was buried after his martyrdom in 258. And it was not long before the word area in Latin was understood as a special African term to designate a specifically Christian cemetery. Delattre quoted also a famous passage from Tertullian saying, "No burial grounds for the Christians." The burial grounds is a translation for areae, the same Latin word. It was then a small step to associate the use of enclosures with a specifically Christian motivation, the necessity of segregating their burials from nearby pagan burials. What is still implicit in Delattre and Lavigerie, and I cannot quote all their publications here, were not only that these Christian cemeteries were in the vicinity of pagan cemeteries, is made explicit in Émile Gzell's comment on the use of areae by Christians in Les Monuments Antiques de l'Algérie, published in 1901. I quote, "The areae are naturally found outside cities." That's naturally because it's the rule for all burials in the ancient cities. Near the pagan tombs, we've seen that it was the case, but separated from them by fences or walls. To bury, is adding Gzell, to bury a Christian amongst idolaters was considered a great impiety, one to be avoided as much as possible. End of quote. The association between area, the Latin word, and Christian cemetery soon became a reality. I will give only one more example. Another excavation by Delattre of a Christian basilica at a place called Sidfa in the neighborhood of Carthage. When Delattre discovered fragments of an inscription bearing the names of the famous martyrs Perpetua and Felicity, he decided to dig at the site of the finding. Again, we see that the primary motivation is finding inscriptions and then trying to find more. And he soon unearthed a basilica. He then identified the basilica at Sidfa with the Basilica Maiorum, the Church of the Ancestors, in which Augustine preached several sermons in honor of the two martyrs, Perpetua and Felicity. Many of Augustine's sermons contains little rubrics saying where these sermons were preached, and that's how we know quite a lot about the topography of Carthage. Because despite more recent excavations, we still rely mostly on text to know something about it. Delattre had previously excavated in the same area, sorry, the word area is used in many different things, a large area, 51 by 41 meter, in front of the basilica, and this area contained various structures. At this point, he describes the area in front of the church as an area ad sepulchra, borrowing the phrase from the Churchill inscription. And he assumed that it was owned by the family of Perpetua and that the martyr and her companions were buried there. And then after the peace of the church, a basilica, a church would have been built nearby. And he goes a little further in his reconstruction. After this, it was another small step to identify the Basilica of Sidfa as the Basilica of the Ancient Cemeteries. You remember that Augustine is saying it's the Basilica of the Ancestors. But Delattre is suggesting that we should supply Basilica Maiorum Arearum. The word was not in Latin, but we supplied. And instead of being the Basilica of the Ancestors, it's the Basilica of the Ancient Cemeteries. And these cemeteries would themselves be none other than the areae that were attacked by pagans, according to the text of Tertullian that I quoted earlier. Modern scholars have, for the most part, accepted these reconstructions. Thus, Yvette Duval wrote in her monumental study of the cult of the martyrs in North Africa, Loca Sanctorum Africae, published in 1992, I quote, "The appearance of a specific term, specific to North Africa, and to Christian, to designate cemeteries that are uniquely Christian, the term area, is a proof of their existence and implies that they were actually under the control of the ecclesiastical institution from before the peace of the church." So you see how the reconstruction is working from mention of areae in a text, another expression in an inscription, and all this put together with some archaeological evidence. And it's important to note that modern scholars have usually been further than the older excavators. You notice in Duvet's quote that now the cemeteries are uniquely Christian, that the term itself is a proof of its existence, and that they're also under the control of the ecclesiastical institution, which none of this is implied in the use of the word itself, and De Lattre and Lavigerie were much more cautious. Let us now consider the two texts that have fueled these speculations on the Christian areae: the inscription from Churchill, discovered by Lavigerie, and the testimony of Tertullian that I mentioned earlier. The Churchill inscription mentions a donation to the church by a pious benefactor, the senator Severianus. The inscription that is preserved is not the original inscription, but rather a commemorative inscription that was engraved by the Church of Caesarea to commemorate the gift. The inscription is from the 4th century. The only elements for dating it are the shape of letters, and we're now much more cautious than we were in the past, using that kind of indications. But it's not unlikely that the donation made by Severianus was earlier and even antedated the peace of the church, but we don't really know neither. It has to be assumed here. The word area appears in the first line of the inscription, where it is usually connected, as I mentioned before, to ad sepulchra. And Severianus is then thought to have donated a cemetery. So the expression area ad sepulchra is put together to mean something specific, cemetery. So Severianus is then thought to have donated a cemetery to the church. But if we look at the text, it is far more logical to construe ad sepulchra with the verb meaning to give, and thus to understand, without so many assumptions, that Severianus intended for the plot he gave to the church to be used for burial. By this interpretation, area does not refer to a cemetery, and not even to a funerary enclosure, but rather to the place in which the monument described in the rest of the inscription was constructed. Just a plot of land with a monument, and that could be used for other burials. The archaeological context of the inscriptions is unknown. More exactly, and I'll say a few more words later on this, the excavations begun by Cardinal Lavigerie, where he discovered the inscriptions, did not yield the expected result. It was a pagan enclosure that he discovered where the inscription was found. And here, we don't know really if it was a pagan or what else enclosure, but the other inscriptions he found in the area contained either formulae that were deemed at the time at least to be pagan and incompatible with Christian. So no excavation or no published record at the time. Thus, we must rely entirely on the inscription for a description of its context. It mentions a cella, very likely a room used for the commemorative rites, and a memoria, probably the tomb itself. The items highlighted in the inscriptions do not refer to a communal burial place, but rather to a very common Roman tomb. You have the monument itself, which can contain several burials, and a structure, cella. It's not a chapel. There's no reason to call it a chapel at this time, but a structure for banquets. And it's a rite that is shared by pagans and Christians in cemeteries. So as I said, the items highlighted in the inscription do not refer to a communal burial place. Moreover, any concern for privating a burial site for others would probably have been mentioned in the inscription. Usually donors are commenting on their main motivations. Here the inscription is totally silent about this. Therefore, although it is obviously impossible to know precisely what it is that Severianus gave to the church, the hypothesis that he gave a cemetery to the Christian community ought to be dismissed. Tertullian's testimony now. Tertullian's testimony does not need to be read in this sense either. Let us look at it more closely. I quote the little passage in which the sentence, "No burial grounds for Christians," is found. And then I explain the larger context. This is what happened, beginning of the quote, for example, when Hilarianus was governor. While people were complaining about the ground where our graves were located, shouting, "No grounds for them, no areae for the Christians," it was actually they, the pagans, the people, who lost their grounds, areae again. Indeed, they did not harvest their grain. Tertullian's intention is to provide a graphic example of divine vengeance against the pagans' persecution of Christians. And this is only one of his examples. He's mentioning something that happened at the time of Hilarianus, a few years before the time he is writing. It thus relates two facts, or correlates two facts, I should say. The pagan outrages against Christian tombs and the famine that resulted from the lack of harvest. He does this by playing on two meanings of the word area. Its most common use, as in threshing ground, and another, well known from epigraphy, as burial ground. Tertullian's choice of the word area was determined by the possibility of exploiting its double meaning, not by any intention to inform historians of the name that Christians gave their cemeteries, and therefore the text cannot be used neither to attest to their existence, at least not in the sense that it has been done. Nothing in his testimony implies that pagans attacked enclosures because they were reserved for Christians, but simply they were enclosures they knew to be owned by Christians. As I suggested earlier when we looked at the enclosure of Ficiales and then in the vicinity the enclosure of the Christians, we don't need to imagine a structure owned by the church or the community, but simply by Christian families. Some members may have been Christians, some not. They were probably all buried together in the same areas. In another text, Tertullian testifies that attacks against the tombs known to be owned by Christians were not uncommon. I quote quickly a text that is well known: "Mad as bacchanals, they spare not even the Christian dead. No, from the repose of the grave, from what I may call a death's asylum, changed as the bodies may be, or mere fragments, they will have them out, reap and rend them." No allusion here again is made to a reserved space that would naturally attract the attention of a vindictive populace, but just tombs known to belong to Christians. In summary, the textual evidence does not guarantee the interpretation of area as a specific North African word for a Christian cemetery in the modern sense of the word. Nor does the archaeological evidence support such an interpretation. I mentioned that Delat unearthed only one wall of his so-called Christian enclosure. We cannot be sure that it was an enclosure. So what I suggest here, but I don't want to push this too far, is that Delat called it an enclosure because he was thinking about the use of the word area in the Churchill inscription and in the text of Tertullian that he is quoting in his presentation of the new inscriptions coming out of this area. In Churchill, as I mentioned before, Lavigerie quickly stopped excavating at the site of the discovery of the inscription when he realized that the tombs in the enclosure were pagan tombs, or more likely that in the same enclosure there were pagan and Christian tombs. We'll never know. Inscriptions have either disappeared or cannot be put in relationship with the actual tombs that were there, because when Lavigerie excavated, he didn't finish the excavation of the area, but he took away the inscriptions, and it was done at the time, And when the excavation was resumed in 1967, the area was still there and the tombs were still there, but we don't know to which tomb which inscription could be attached. But again, very likely a mixed burial area. The last reconstruction at the site of the Sitfa Basilica has also met with difficulty at the archaeological level. Indeed, in 1929, during a cleanup, an exedra was brought to light in the aforementioned area at a level that was likely deeper than the rectangular enclosure. However, neither the available plans nor the reports allow any conclusion. It seemed that the excavators had failed to distinguish several successive stages, and both at the time of Delat and at the time of the cleanup in 1929. Therefore, it is far from certain that the rectangular enclosure is a funerary area predating the basilica. It could, and this is in fact much more likely, simply be an atrium, a courtyard, dating to the time when the basilica was constructed in the 5th century, or it could even be a later addition. So the inscription for Perpetua and Felicity does not indicate necessarily their place of burial, but may have been a commemorative inscription that was there, put there much later. Before concluding, I need to going in the wrong sense. I need to consider two testimonies from North Africa that had often been brought forward to support the principle of a segregation of the Christian dead. We will see, at least for the second one, how a new reading shows something quite different and consistent with what I said so far. The first is a passage from Tertullian, again, in his treatise on idolatry. I quote, "We may live with the heathens, the pagans, die with them, we may not." And a lot of scholars have taken this little sentence totally out of context and said, well, here we have a rule saying in a Christian text that Christian and pagan dead cannot be in the same place. But the text must be understood in its context. Tertullian is commenting upon 1 Corinthians 10, 14 and following, where Paul explains that we must certainly flee idolatry, but that we should not offend the pagans. Thus, I paraphrase a long text, it is permissible to accept an invitation to eat at a pagan's house and to eat what is served without asking questions. You recognize the theme of the letter of the Corinthians here, of course. But if the meat is presented as coming from a sacrifice, it must be refused. So Tertullian basically developed the interpretation already, or the position already adopted by Paul on this issue. But then he concludes, where there is social intercourse, which is permitted by the apostle, there is also sinning, which is permitted by no one. We may live with the heathens, die with them, we may not, and you recognize the sentence before. So the death in question in this sentence is caused by sin, and it has nothing to do with being dead and buried, but it repeats the first sentence and said that you can have social interactions with the pagans, but you're not supposed to sin with them. And if you sin with them, you're going to die, hence the sentence. So this text does not help us understanding really anything about burial segregation. The second text is a letter that is included in the correspondence of Cyprian of Carthage, who was executed in 258. It is a response by Cyprian and his African colleagues to the Spanish communities of Legio Astorica and Emerita. They discussed the deposition of the bishops Basilides and Martialis, who had obtained certificates of sacrifice during the persecution of Decius in 250. The Emperor Decius has issued an edict imposing on all the inhabitants of the empire to sacrifice to the Roman gods. The edict did not target the Christians and did not launch a persecution, But obviously, some Christians, we'll see, did not accept to comply, were sent to prison. Some of them died in prison. There was no execution, strictly speaking, because of the order to sacrifice. But prisons in Roman times were, well, not sure that prisons are much nicer, but at least it was quite common to die in prison, either of disease or even starving, because people there were not supported by their goals. Anyway, so the edict did not target the Christians and did not launch a persecution. Indeed, it appears that a majority of Christians complied with the edict, and I cannot enter here into the details. Few refused, and as I said, were sent to prison. Others, like the two Spanish bishops, avoided to sacrifice, but did not bear the testimony of their faith, and bought a certificate of sacrifice. Because you needed to get a certificate, to go sacrifice, and in fact not really sacrifice, you needed to go up to an altar, eat a little piece of sacrificed meat, and then you were given a little sacrifice, and you could go home. So we know that some Christians did not sacrifice, but bought a certificate in order also to avoid being in trouble with the authorities. So the two Spanish bishops did that. Martialis' case was aggravated by other accusations brought against him, and in particular, and that's where Burial is coming back, bear with me, and in particular his membership in a collegium, one of these many voluntary associations that were so common in the Greco-Roman cities after the 2nd century. Not only, according to the letter, did Martialis participate in the banquets of this association, but he also buried his sons in the communal tomb of the collegium. That was something that was sought after with the membership in these associations. A burial ground that was owned collectively, and therefore it was cheaper to find a tomb within it. So when I say communal, I don't intend community. Here it's more kind of sharing a commodity to some extent. And this is how Cyprian in the letter is describing what Martialis did. He buried his sons in the same collegium. In the manner of foreign peoples, they are interred in the company of strangers among heathen graves. So the indignation of Cyprian is obvious, but it is also obvious that it was not shared by all Christians, and not even by all members of the Christian clergy. We're talking about two bishops here. There is, furthermore, no indication that Martialis got into trouble with his congregation before he obtained a certificate of sacrifice. What I mean is that there is no indication that the congregation of Leo Astoria and Emerita had any issue with Martialis belonging to an association and burying his sons there. This accusation is added in the letter when they need to build up a case. We have to be cautious with that. So this suggests that Christians in Spain, as in North Africa, adopted a range of attitudes when it came to choose a place of burial. In most cases, though it is difficult to document, especially because of the state of our archaeological documentation, so in most cases, Christians were buried close to their family members, and at this time, it meant alongside pagan tombs. We have to remember we're in the second or first half of the 3rd century when most Christian would have been born in non-Christian families. In any case, the letter of Cyprian does not constitute a general rule against the mixing of pagan and Christian tombs in a cemetery, i.e. a complete separation of Christians and pagans in death. It specifically addresses the issue of the recourse to an association for funerals and burial. Indeed, the choice of a burial in the monument of an association would have meant for Christians to be involved with the libations and sacrifices usually performed for the collective commemoration of the dead. We also know from other inscriptions that these associations were providing a place for burial, but were also celebrating collectively their dead, and it involve, to some extent, and this is a delicate issue, some form of sacrifice. I conclude now very briefly. So we can now conclude that no evidence supports the notion of a principle, no evidence supports the notion of a separation of pagans and Christians in death and burial, neither in practice nor in principle. It does not seem that North Africa was an exception in this regard, but few areas offer the same abundance of evidence, and thus the possibility of challenging some of the common assumptions about changes brought forth by Christianity. Burial, it appears, was less a matter of religion than of family. Thank you.
Molte grazie per questo paper così duttile, così aperto alle varie discipline archeologiche, testuali che servono per ricostruire la storia della tarda antichità e delle identità. Ho il piacere adesso di presentare il professor John Parker, che è membro di una delle più gloriose istituzioni per lo studio dell'orientalistica dell'Africa e dell'Asia, quale è la SOAS in Londra, no? E studioso dell'Africa, soprattutto moderna. You are now editing a volume, one of the beautiful handbooks of Oxford Handbook for Modern African Studies. Parlerà di histories of of life and death in Ghana. Thank you.
With the emphasis on death. Thank you very much, Alberto. This paper I'm going to give today forms part of a larger project on a history of death and the ends of life in Ghana, or what would become Ghana. It's tentatively called In My Time of Dying, a term I take from an old African-American blues song. And indeed, the old ballads and folk music of the southern part of the United States has been a great inspiration to this project. In terms of sort of creating what I see as a counter-hegemonic story about grand narratives of death. Now, I want to begin with a very simple observation that in terms of scholarship on Africa and indeed beyond,